We're going to pick up where we left off, talking about my favorite quote recently of Albert Camus here, and developing it with some recent science that just came out. Actually, the answer to something I've been looking for a long time. A lot of us who are interested in some interesting concepts in science about time travel. And there was sort of an answer that came out this week. And when I read it, I'm like, oh, this is awesome. Fits perfectly with where we're at in our process, but it also resolves a lot of questions and folds into spirituality quite nicely. I'm going to start with my experience that I had personally myself some today. I got a Pac-Man, console and the Atari console and all the various games back in the 1980s, like a lot of people my age. And recently I just saw this laying in my house, and I don't understand why there's just one Atari game laying around. But I immediately recognized, because I use Pac-Man as a reference all the time as to explain the nature of the world that we're in. And in a little bit, I'm going to explain it again using this literal cartridge, and it'll be helpful given the science that was just recently discussed regarding time travel. And so when I saw this morning, I was like, wow, everything does happen for a reason. I don't know why this was laying out independently in my house, but there it is. I'm going to use it as a prop coming up. So we will put that right here, and we'll get to that in a little bit. Now, continuing our journey, which is, like I've said, soon I'm going to start teaching a series on the hero's journey, which is one of my favorite concepts, and it folds in again very nicely to this Camus quote, whether people know it or not. We're all moving in the direction of the rebellion that he talks about, because who wants to be stuck? Who wants to be unfree? We all have a craving inside of ourselves to be free. And where we get stuck, and again, there's a physical aspect to this, of course. No one wants to be physically enslaved. That makes sense. And there's a whole lot of physical world experiences like that. But you could be completely physically free and still very much stuck. Why? Because all of us have the same goal, whether we know it or not. All of us have the same journey. We are all moving towards the Christ consciousness. It's what we're here for. We're here to have a physical experience and move towards this thing called the Christ, and that Christ is to be revealed inside of all of us. All of us are doing this. And again, as I wrote in New Eyes, a rose by any other name would still smell as sweet. It doesn't have to use the word Christ. You could talk about Buddha nature or Krishna consciousness or any other concept. But the fact is, each of us have a little piece of divinity placed inside of us. You're born with it. It's part of your DNA. All of us have it. And so we get stuck when we come into the physical world and we identify ourselves as physical and all the various labels that get associated with it. And then everyone starts to judge everyone else because of their labels. And we know this doesn't work. The world's been doing this forever because we identify primarily as those labels. And so when people argue and debate about that, we end up feeling really stuck for many reasons. Now, you could be right about certain things, but you still feel emotionally stuck. The way to get freed is to move over here in my little spirit block, is to realize you are a consciousness being, a spiritual being, having a physical experience. And so we get separated, and then we have to learn how to love each other independent of those labels. I call it unified diversity, right? Well, chapter or verse 18 in the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus says very specifically, when you stand at the beginning and you recognize what the end is, congratulations to that person, he will not taste death. Congratulations, if you're standing at the beginning and you see what the end is, you will not taste death. Well, what does that mean? When you realize, and this, the beginning could be this moment, when you realize what the end is, unity, coming together in spirit, all of us realizing the Christ within, all of us getting to the God nature self, all of us. But when you realize that, congratulations, you will not taste death. Why will you not taste death? Because once you know you're a spiritual being, this thing dies. It's sort of like just taking off my sweater and washing it. I'm wearing it now, but it's not dying when I take it off. We wear an ego for a while. We wear our labels for a while. Spiritually speaking, there's no labels. At least not the physical kind that we're associated with. Like I said, there's where all the isms show up, because we have all these obsessions with how people are different than us. But spiritually, no, it's unity. It's all the same. When asked the most important commandment, Jesus said, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord is one." And in Hebrew, Israel means someone who's connected to God or wrestling with God. And so if you're wrestling with God or you're connected to God, the Lord is one. Why is it one? Because it's in you, it's in me, it's in every single person. And when you think of yourself as better than or worse than, what you're not taking into account is that every single person has the Christ seed inside of themselves. It's like an acorn growing into an oak tree. Oak trees aren't better than acorns just because they're further along in their development. An oak tree would recognize, oh, little acorn, one day you'll be an oak tree. So we live in a world where we've got all these different costumes and all these different labels and all these different levels of development. Luke 2:52, Jesus grew in stature and in favor with God and man. I'm like, wait, I thought he was perfect from birth. I thought he didn't have to grow anyway. I thought he already was God. I don't understand. Well, of course he was already God. You are too. He himself said, know ye not ye are gods, right? Well, of course you have the God in you, but what else do you have? You have this ego that blocks it. And that needs to be removed, if you will. Course in Miracles calls it a barrier. And so every one of us is God, small g, point of emphasis, but we have to also grow in stature, as Jesus did, by removing these layers, by removing the barriers that we have to realize the Christ within. We all have to do it. So that's what he's talking about in verse 18. There's a Chinese proverb that says, we are all on the same journey. Those who blame others haven't started. Those who blame themselves are halfway there, and those who blame no one have arrived. That's because we have to get to this place of complete freedom to realize that we're in a system that's very difficult, very challenging. What's Buddha's first teaching? We're all going to suffer. All of us are going to suffer, and that was coming from a millionaire. You know, the Buddha was a prince. He suffered too. His money didn't make him happy, and he had to go on a journey towards enlightenment in order to finally feel the peace he was looking for. And so everyone suffers, including the Buddha. Well, he was Siddhartha. The Buddha means to wake up, and that's what happens on this journey when you wake up to the true nature of reality. Course in Miracles calls the world an illusion too, just like Albert Einstein did. So they're all saying the same thing. We're in this physical form for a while, waking up to the true nature of reality. That's known as Buddha. And Buddha said the same thing as Jesus. You're also a God. You are Buddha too. So they're all saying it. You have to have this process. So if you're on the same journey, everyone is, you might have a different level of development. That part's definitely true. And that would explain all the chaos in the world in so many ways. Why do people act different? Why do people treat people badly? The more filled with spirit you are, the less likely you're going to be a jerk, right? It's literally in prison again yesterday. They love this stuff in prison. I met 40 new guys in prison. And we were talking about this. And when I said to them, hurt people, it's like 39 of them nodding their head. Right? Why do people end up like that? Well, most likely they were somehow hurt or abused when they were younger. What do we have to do? Hurt them more? Or do we show them love and grace of what Christ consciousness is? That's what gets people's vibration moving in the right direction. It's what we have to do collectively if we want humanity to change. It's what we have to do. So this brings me to the point of what I want to emphasize today. These three things are linked together in the concept called superposition. Now that's one of my favorite science concepts. I've done a couple videos on it. It takes too long to talk about right now. It's just a really cool concept. And I'm going to mention it, I'm going to talk about it using three different concepts, okay? But the first one is right here in the middle, called the grandfather paradox. And so I was reading just in the last week, a scientific article, I think it's from Science Alert online, talking about how the grandfather paradox has been resolved. Well, theoretically. And the grandfather paradox is a time travel paradox. Einstein, 100 years ago, his general relativity predicts the existence of time loops or time travel where an event can be both in the past and in the future at the same time. Now, it was Albert Einstein again, basically discussed the fact that time travel is theoretically possible. Well, this led people immediately to ponder, okay, well, if that's possible, does that mean I could go back in the past and kill my grandfather? And if I could do that, could I ever be born to go back into the past and kill my grandfather? Now, if you did go back in the past and kill your grandfather, then how could you ever be born, right? Well, that's the paradox. So Einstein and friends, plenty of others, and I've seen more than a few articles, which demonstrate or discuss that based upon quantum physics, that time travel is possible. It leads to these types of paradoxes. But that's only if you're thinking with the ego, okay? That's only if we're thinking linearly. Because you think time goes last year, now, next year, and you're moving forward, like in time somehow. Well, your spirit doesn't do that. Your ego is doing that. So your ego thinks that way. How does it go back in the past and do this? Well, I'm going to show you, where did I put it? It's over there. I'm going to show you in a scripture verse in which Jesus in John 14:2, he says, my Father's house has many rooms. Father's house has many rooms. What is he trying to say there? Well, it's not just one room, it's just not one universe. There's multiple dimensions. There are many physicists who call it the multiverse now. We're so focused on just this one. Well, Pac-Man is like that. Here I have a universe, and inside this universe is every single thing Pac-Man could possibly do. And Pac-Man, there's ghosts in here, and there's cherries and cookies, and there's the whole game to be played inside here, and I'm holding it all in the palm of my hand, okay? So Pac-Man's stuck in this thing too, isn't he? And isn't Pac-Man controlled? He's a character inside of a system, a game that we on the outside of the system can play. And if you get what I'm talking about here, we've got a guy that's unfree inside a system with ultimate number of variations, an infinite number of variations. My father's house has many rooms. There's many different things you could be doing, and yet Pac-Man doesn't do any of it. It's being controlled by the character outside of Pac-Man. I could put this in an Atari console, and then with the joystick, move the character around, right? Well, that's the relationship we have to have with our spirit, ultimately. And if you get that concept, go read the Bible. Jesus says stuff like, I'm doing nothing. I'm listening to my Father. He tells me what to do. Well, Pac-Man, if he had that awareness, would go, I'm not doing nothing. I'm listening to Steve. He's on the couch. He's playing me. Our egos and our physical existence is like this Pac-Man. And it's a character inside the game. And my father's house has many rooms. Well, how many different games could you play? When I was a kid, I had like 100 cartridges. There's not just one. Now I had to play Pac-Man. I also had Frogger and Space Invaders and those types of games. Never once did I play Pac-Man and Frogger showed up, never. Nor did I play Frogger and then Space Invaders showed up. Notice how inside the system, I could only play based upon the code inside the system. There's no Frogger in here. Now we're in a system. Superposition is pretty much the name of the system. It's an earth game. I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me means you can play this game peacefully, independent of what happens to you in it. When Pac-Man dies in this, does anybody really die? No, of course not, just a character. And I'm playing the character from outside the system. Well, that's the world that we're in. You put in this game and then you play a game with the full awareness that when the game is over, you're not dying, you're just going to go play something else. Human beings come into form, and then we think we're the characters in the game, but we're not. Christ, or Jesus, I should say, who became Christ, because, he developed that part of himself, he knew, I can't die. In fact, I'm going to show people how to win the game. I'm going to go ahead and get crucified. It's not going to be fair, but I'm not going to complain about it either. I'm going to do what I need to do as my Father tells me to do, the spirit outside of the game, so to speak. And so he let himself die, but then he went back into the game called the resurrection. Well, I could stop playing this game, and then I could start playing it again, couldn't I? All right, that's not amazing. Well, once you realize that we're in a system, and a system with very specific rules, you now realize, oh man, you can die and come back. Well, that makes some sense. But you better learn who you really are, this thing outside the system. And again, in a word, we're just calling that Christ. Christ is, I left it up there from last week, is to be anointed with the Spirit. That's what it literally means. And it's not his last name or his nickname, okay? It's his level of consciousness. So some people are here. Rumi says there's 7,000 or 70,000 different levels. And there's 8 billion people. There's a lot of levels of Christ. But guess what? We're all Christ. Just some aren't very well formed. That's it. And they behave accordingly, exactly as you'd expect. So what does Jesus say? Forgive them. They know not what they do. They're acting in accordance or similar to the ghosts in this game. What do the ghosts do in this game? Mindlessly go attacking, right? They're zombies. Jesus talks about the dead tending to the dead in this world, right? What's he talking about? No, don't worry about the dead people. No, he's referring to people who don't have the Spirit activated. That's dead. Lazarus, he rose him from the dead. If you think that was physical, fine. But I'm telling you, it's spiritual. Jesus gave him the third eye is what he gave him, so he could see the truth. That's what it means. And Jesus wasn't just worried about fixing people's eyes, healing the blind. He was giving them sight. He was giving them third eye sight. Okay, so that's the game that we're in. We're in that system, and everyone's in that system. So if you can embrace that, here's where the science of the grandfather paradox comes into play. And I've been using whack-a-mole as a therapeutic concept for a long time. Now, you know the game whack-a-mole, that if you're in an arcade and all these moles come, you're supposed to bash them on the head, but as soon as you bash one on the head, another one shows up and you gotta, it's fun watching kids play that, right? getting all excited, but can you really win that game? And if you just keep it on, the moles are just going to keep coming up. Well, guess what? That's life in our problems, okay? So we have an experience in which problems just keep showing up. And we keep trying to bash all these moles on the head. And there's just going to be an endless array of them. There's really only one problem, metaphor or air quotes, we're supposed to be addressing. It's the awakening experience. It's why Rumi says we're only here to do one thing. You can go to do a great many other things, but if you don't do the one thing, you've done nothing at all. But if you do the one thing you're supposed to be doing, says Rumi, then you've done everything. Everything else, I just call it blah, blah, blah. It's Charlie Brown's teacher. You're allowed to go play with all that, no doubt about it. In fact, you can practice. Jesus says to use the Course in Miracles says to use the flesh to teach spirit. And if in whatever your causes are, you're practicing the Christ consciousness, excellent. That's what you should be doing. Jesus says to you, the world is the footstool and the kingdom of heaven is the throne. So this place is the footstool. And it helps you step up higher, for sure. But can you practice Christ in all your experiences? Yes, you can. Is everyone doing that? Most people aren't. And many people who don't understand religion very well aren't either. They're sitting in judgment of others, saying I'm superior because this is what my prophet told me to say. And they're just like the ghosts in Pac-Man. They're just programmed. I just heard just earlier, there's a movie out now called Wild Robot, I think. And I was told that it's a robot. It's like an animated movie. It's in the theaters now. And this young woman told me that this robot goes into the woods, and I think a bird sort of takes it under its wing, no pun intended, and sort of deprograms it because the robot has this task to do. And this is my understanding of it, at least. I want to go see this. But I'm like, well, that's exactly what's happening here. We're down here programmed because we do what daddy told us and then what his daddy told him and daddy, all the way down there. Speaking of grandfathers, okay? We're a bunch of human beings who are programmed egos is what we are. And that's why we're robotic. It's what's known as dead. We're not filled with the Spirit. And yet, when you get filled with the Spirit, everything changes. And so you can play whack-a-mole all you want, but there's only one thing you can do to stop those moles from keep popping up. Unplug the system, okay? You have to get outside of the ego to actually experience this. To get outside the ego is to love another as oneself, right? It is to be forgiving. It's to trust. Jesus gave no commandments other than to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. That pretty much covers it. That means love in every circumstance. And that man walked to the cross to demonstrate it. Street cred, okay? That doesn't mean you have to agree with other people. It means you have to love them even if you disagree. That's if you want the Christ consciousness. All right, so here comes the grandfather paradox, which gets resolved here. Now, this man's name, he's from the University of Queensland in Australia. Jermaine Tobar, sorry to pronounce it wrong. Mr. Tobar here, what he did was he resolved the grandfather paradox by, quote, squaring the numbers. I don't understand the math. I'm not even going to try. How could we? Okay. But that's not the point. But I'm going to trust that what this guy did worked. All the mathematicians are agreeing. Oh, yeah, he figured it out. He squared the numbers. And he resolved the paradox this way. And you'll see how it links to John 14:2. He resolved the paradox essentially by breaking out of linear thinking. Because to go back in time and kill your grandfather, which means you can never be born, is linear thinking. My father's house has many rooms is not linear thinking. Superposition is multiple timelines. It's an infinite number of timelines. So you'd have to go back in time and jump to another timeline. Could I or could a programmer introduce a new game in which Frogger and Pac-Man meet? Sure they could. They could call it Frogger Man or something. I don't know. In fact, Ms. Pac-Man came after this, and I know there are games in which they're both included. So you could write a new code to include them. Well, my father's house or mansion has many rooms means, oh, there's code indeed where I could go back in time, not kill my grandfather, I wouldn't do that. I'd go back and meet him, but all of a sudden I'm out of the time loop. It's a new time loop, or a one that was an infinite time loop. I've just jumped into another timeline. And that timeline, because everything's possible inside this game, relative to the game, I can go back, meet my grandfather, and then say to him, hey, guess what? I'm from the future. I'm your grandson in the future, and I'm coming back, and now I just diverted your path. You might meet someone else now, and you're going to have another grandson. He'll be my cousin grandson, I guess. And then a whole new timeline unfolds. And so there's no paradox there. You just have to jump timelines. Research superposition and realize infinite number of timelines. We can't think linearly. And here's Tobar's example, or at least in this article, the example. To give an example, imagine a time traveler journeying back into the past to stop a disease from spreading. If the mission is successful, the time travel would have no disease to go back in time to even defeat. Get it? So like, let's say we wanted to go back and stop COVID. And you go back 5 years and you know the origin or whatever. And then you alter that. The math says this. Tobar's work suggests that the disease would still escape some other way, through a different route or by a different method, removing the paradox. Meaning, that part of the future would still unfold in a certain kind of way. You might call it destiny, okay? Well, that's gonna happen. And so there's really no paradox. And again, that's mathematics, don't understand it. I'm just gonna trust these guys know what they're talking about. Plus the science of it makes sense. Can I jump inside this game and change something inside this game relative to the grand? No, I can't, because this game is limited. But what if I jumped over to Frogger? I could do something altogether different there. If you jump onto another timeline, everything's possible. So here's where we pull it all together. We set it up in the beginning that we're all here to work on this one thing. And if you practice something else, you could try to go solve a disease or go feed the homeless or try to win a Super Bowl. So many things you can do. On and on and on. But the one thing you can't avoid, which is whack-a-mole and the grandfather paradox and John 14:2 all together, you have to become Christ conscious. In the Buddhist philosophy or in Eastern philosophy, you're going to go around the wheel again and again and again. They call the wheel samsara. And samsara is just the eternal loop. It's more like this. It's a hamster wheel that goes this way. And if all you do in every lifetime you experience is pay attention to the ego, and you live inside your ego costume, we're a zombie. If that's all you do. And you never make any progress, just going round and round like that. But in the first, I have it over here, in the first step of the Eightfold Path of the Buddha's right view, he says the same thing as Jesus. In essence, you have to love another as oneself, because literally other people are you. Do that in another group. Literally, they come from the same source as you, and the only way you can get out is to love them as yourself. Whoa, that's tough work, isn't it? Well, guess what? You have all of infinity to pull that off. And you might need to come back 17 more lifetimes. Or just realize it now. And when you realize it now, you find yourself in a system where everyone is required to do this. Some are just further along than others. Now it's much easier to love those because you know that they're toddlers in their development. Like I said, that doesn't define, anything you do about yourself physically. That's why Jesus gave no commandments, physical commands. Nor did Buddha. He just gave suggestions. You have to love another as oneself, but how you experience that, that's up to you. John 7:24, judge not by mere appearance, judge correctly. If you are loving someone from the heart on this level, you might do a wide array of different things. My job isn't to judge you for what you're doing. My job is, as he says, to judge correctly. Are you doing it with the spirit of love on the Christ level? Well, then if that's what you're doing, I'll step back. Then if you're doing it another way, I'm going to love you to try to maybe correct you. Jesus corrected the disciples all the time. And he wanted them to step up their game a little bit, right? Peter, get behind me, Satan. You're offending me. He wanted people to get up to speed, right? He chewed them out all the time. And people didn't really understand him. Well, if you're interested in this, you have to understand it. And then have that awareness. So Course in Miracles calls the curriculum mandatory. Love it. Just on the first page, the curriculum is mandatory. It's the same thing as saying if you're going to play Pac-Man, then you have to play it to completion. I don't know if there's an end to Pac-Man, say you clear 100 boards or something. But you're going to go to 100 boards before you're done, and you can't get out until you've done that. Then everyone's going to play this to completion. Every being on earth is going to play this game to completion. And the only way you can facilitate that process is being the light, right? I have to spread the spirit to others. That's the only thing I can do to help. Certainly arguing with people over things isn't help unless you're doing it with spirit. Then argue all you want. Because then you're just setting the light and the love out while you're telling them that they're idiots. You're allowed to do that. But where does hate ever help? I think I said this last week. The fifth line, I think in the Dhammapada of the Buddha, is literally, you can't out-hate haters. Your hate will not be distilled by more hate, right? Which means, guess what? Gotta love. And that's all we're talking about here. Loving on such a level that, as we left this up there from last week, the crown of life, it says in James, you receive the crown of life whenever you see this process to the end. Last week we talked about how Jesus said, or James said, that you should consider all your adversities joy. Wow, that's hard work, right? All your adversities. Paul says to rejoice in your sufferings. Consider all your adversities joy. Why? Because each one of them is an opportunity, like whack-a-mole. Love, 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 love. Every mole that comes up. Love it, 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 love it. You keep doing that, next thing you know, you're exhausted, the game gets unplugged, you're done, right? Try it any other way, it won't work. Jesus specifically says, my way is easier. My burden is light and my yoke, my burden is light and my yoke is easy. Try it any other way, and it's just going to be harder. But if you try it with love, it always works. And that's the rebellious thing to do, okay? Everyone thinks it's easy to go ahead and try it. Let's hate them more, okay? Maybe if we hate them differently, Lead with love. That love will then tell you what to do. Now you're listening to something outside the system. Now you're listening to a higher voice, the higher self, the Christ consciousness, whatever. That's the Father Jesus is talking about. And then it'll tell you what to do inside the system. Who to talk to. This is actually Luke 12:12. The Holy Spirit will tell you the words to say. If Steve does it, he fails all the time. But if I step into the oneness of things, the Holy Spirit tells me what to say. And now Steve's out of the way. Whew, thank goodness. Jesus, my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. My ways are higher than your ways. And the Buddha calls it right speech. I mean, they're nailing it together. They're saying the same thing. All the prophets do it one way or the other. But the goal and the objective is the same. We're all on the same journey. We're all moving towards love. Ego causes all the pain and suffering. You might be further along than others in your journey, but the only way to help them is to love them along the way as well.